Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Dracut Arts.
And I'm Tom McGarry with Dracut Arts.
Today, we will explore cultural appropriation with Native American flautist Hawk Henries and Reverend Atula Jamar. Reverend Jamar is a pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Lowell. She earned her master's and PhD from Yale Divinity School and BU, respectively. Atula worked at theological institutions in India as a researcher for the International Bulletin of Missionary Research for the Overseas Ministries Study Center in New Haven, Connecticut, prior to assuming her pastorate. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I'm really excited to have this discussion. So, what does cultural appropriation mean?
Well, I think it is taking off something without permission from a cultural group by a dominant group and making it their own, and without acknowledging it, using it for profit, a commercialization of cultural relics, artifacts, practices, and ideas from taking from a cultural group. And that's a distortion and exploitation of the identity, the value, and the principles and sacredness of that particular cultural group.
So when someone takes something from another culture, isn't it a sign of respect or honoring that thing that has been taken?
I'm of the thinking that there's a difference between appropriation and appreciation. And I think that with regard to the latter, appreciation would present itself, or would be, here I'm stammering. I think it would mean that a person or persons who had an interest in another culture would approach them and express that interest, and then be willing to listen and gather whatever information the people were willing to share. Appropriation is, as Atula said, where aspects of a people's culture is taken, exploited, misrepresented, misused for the benefit of the taker, not necessarily the benefit of the culture they're taking from. I do think there's a bit of a difference.
Yeah, it's also a humiliation, right? It is humiliating to see one's cultural attire, for example, misused. For instance, a prestigious shawl attributed to certain members of a cultural group, seen as being worn upside down, or a woman's traditional attire, for example, a wraparound, which is worn from waist down, is used as tablecloth or worn as a shawl. You know, it's an insult to another culture, to others' culture.
An insult, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's taking something without understanding what it really means and what it stands for, right? Almost taking the heart or soul out of that object or piece or music or piece of art or even a tradition. I'm wondering
I think it happens even with understanding, though. I mean, I think simply it's taking without permission. And there are many components to that. There are people who certainly understand what it is that, what they're taking, what the object might be, how it's used, why it's used in particular context, but they take it anyway. And again, for the benefit of themselves rather than for the benefit of the people they're taking it from. So I think in some cases there might be lack of understanding, but not always.
Yeah, when you talk about lack of understanding, that's another huge part of it. Using or wearing, for example, sacred artifacts without knowing its meaning is not right. And I think this happens also due to, as you said, lack of understanding, lack of awareness, maybe not giving an effort to learn more about it, taking it for granted, seeing it as something different or mysterious or interesting.
Hmm.
Mm.
Could you give examples of this? Could either of you have examples so that it would be concrete so people could I'm thinking of an example I know where someone was trying to understand um and I'm trying to remember the festival. I think it was for Passover, and some friend said, "Oh, here my friend is having a Passover celebration. So, in order to help them celebrate, I'll bring them a gift of food," and brought them bagels because that was the only Jewish food they knew of. But Jews don't have bagels over Passover. They have unleavened bread. So there was this gesture of goodwill that didn't work because because the actual follow through wound up being laughable. It wasn't even an insult because it was so silly, right? So that also brings up the point of whose responsibility is it to understand another culture? Do the people who have the culture that someone is trying to dominate need to teach, or is it the dominant culture's responsibility to learn about the other culture?
I think with regard to your example of bringing bagels, I love the intention,
Yeah.
and my feeling is that a gift being brought to you, whoever you might be, with the intention of being giving, is something to be honored and celebrated. There was no ill intent in that. It was to honor what was happening. And I think that's quite a bit different than this concept, this idea of taking.
Hmm.
So, just as another example of misunderstanding or not understanding in many of the ceremonies that we have, people bring, I guess I'm being repetitive here, or at least I'm going to repeat your example to some degree. Um, in our home, we don't have alcohol at all. And sometimes when we have gatherings and different types of ceremonies, people will bring a bottle of wine or a bottle of something as their gift to us. And our response is to thank them, to express our gratitude for them, for their generosity, but then to explain why it is we choose not to use alcohol or have alcohol in our home or at our ceremonies. So I think at that point, it's my responsibility, my family and I, our responsibility to share the particulars about whatever the issue might be, that aspect of our culture. But then it's incumbent upon the person who's listening or the people who are listening to act upon that maybe the next time, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Sure,
There are many examples. Oh, go ahead.
no, you're asking them to really hear what you have to say, to really listen and take in what you're explaining to them too, which
The truth is, at least my truth is that I'm responsible for what I share. I can't force anyone else, and nor do I demand that anyone else use the knowledge or even gather the knowledge, listen to what it is that I'm saying. I don't want to place that kind of energy in the sharing that I'm doing. So my job, my responsibility is to share whatever information or knowledge that I have, and then on some level um, to let go of my expectations of how whoever's listening receives it or what they do with it.
I was thinking of two things, Hawk. One is, first of all, I've called you a Native American flautist, and I never asked you if it was okay to use the term Native American. And I hope that it is, but I'm not sure if it is.
Well, I think I'm not a flautist. I play flutes. uh, Diane, I don't particularly care for the term Native American.
Mm.
I think that it's misleading. Uh, it implies that indigenous people are the first Americans, the Native Americans, and of course we're not. We're Nipmuc or Haudenosaunee or Lakota or there's 600 or more cultures of indigenous people, and we each have our own names for ourselves. So by calling us all the same, it doesn't acknowledge the individual cultures that exist. But then I think it further suggests that we are one culture, and that culture arises with the concept of America. And of course it doesn't. It's much, 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 much older than America is.
So what would you actually like to be called and introduced as?
Hawk.
Just Hawk, not a flute player, not an First Nation person.
Well, I understand your question, and that's just the clown in me that comes out every now and then.
That's okay.
I
We
think-
need clowns.
I
It
think-
gets very serious sometimes. Conversation. Well, it's a very
You know,
vulnerable one.
I think when using terms like indigenous or First Nations or Native peoples, when we don't know how the group identifies themselves, I think that that's a fine way to open more discussion. Of course, a simple question, and I'm asked oftentimes, how do you want to be? I guess you just did it. How do you want to be labeled, if you will, or how do you think about your own people as Indians or Native Americans? And so that I love when people ask the question, because it opens the door, I think, for meaningful discussion. So yeah.
So what would you like to be used? Or would you just like
For
this
me,
discussion?
for me personally, I'm happy with Hawk. For if you're referencing who my people are, we're Nipmuc. We're Nipmuc people. We're Algonquin speaking Northeast Woodlands peoples, but there's a lot of, I won't do the whole hand thing. There are a lot of Algonquin speaking people. In fact, 75% of the indigenous people on this continent are Algonquin speaking people who originate from where we're at, from this area that we think of as New England. And we each have, a name for ourselves. Here where I'm living in Maine, I guess we're all living in Maine, there's Wabanaki people, which is a collective of different nations of people. In Southern New England, which is where I'm from originally, besides Nipmuc, there's Wampanoag, I don't know numbers, but there's quite a few different nations of indigenous people from what we think of as Southern New England. Collectively, we call ourselves Wampanoag. It's the same word, different dialect. Wabanaki, Wampanoag, it means those who greet the dawn, or I like to think of it as those who invite the light. Our responsibility is to invite the light to be present each day, to sing the sun up, if you will. But I think of it beyond the scope of the sun, and think of it as the light, the Creator's light. I'm drinking caffeinated tea. I'll warn you.
Well, I mean, you said that, and my most wonderful activity first thing every morning is to go out and greet my chickens and look at the day, just scan the horizon and look at the day and how it's beginning and how it has come to me and how I
Mhm.
have
And
come to
you
live.
to it. Absolutely. I love that. I love the simplicity of that. And, you know, I wish that there was a magic button somewhere here where I could press it and all people would do that, would just go out and just be, and maybe breathe in the coming of the day, and then go about whatever responsibilities and work and jobs they had. But I think it would bring such a change in terms of how we relate to this place where we live and to each other, if we were to just take a few moments like that and just greet the day that way. It's like a breath of gratitude.
Yeah. That's why I love my hens.
And I love my chickadees and squirrels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Uh, so how could someone who wanted to be appropriate learn how to be appropriate? How can one expand this gap, as you will, that has come from so much cultural appropriation and the taking and the purported ownership or almost whitewashing and changing of other people's cultures and ideas and deep meanings and spiritual values even? How can that be reconciled or understood? And how can one as an individual affect positive change in this area?
I think I think to begin with, by having the desire to do that. And I think once we have the desire, then we'll seek out the places where that kind of uh, the questions that arise with that desire can be spoken to. We'll seek out knowledge, and we'll observe, what it is that's going on close by us. There are so many people who think of indigenous people as, or in the past tense, that we existed in the past and not today. And I'm always surprised when I visit schools. I do a lot of work in schools all around the country, and I'm always surprised when not coming from students, but the questions that come from teachers, such as, do you live in a teepee?
Oh, wow.
How did you get to the school? Questions that clearly come from their ignorance, in the truest sense of the word, their lack of knowledge about indigenous people. They see us, they put us in a place of 100 or 200 or 500 years ago, and not realizing that we're their neighbors and their friends. And so I think when a person has the desire, then opportunities to satiate that question or those questions will present themselves. There are numerous sources of information, whether they're online or in libraries. There are public events, museums, different places where a person can go and gather knowledge about the indigenous people who live here. And yeah.
I have to say, when I homeschooled my kids, and when I was doing that, I looked for the indigenous peoples in every area that we were in, and not just Massachusetts and New Hampshire, where I am right now, but also when we went to Minnesota for peoples there, and around San Antonio, Texas, for peoples there. Those are three very, very different geographic areas. They also had different tribes there. And it was
Mhm.
very difficult to find information that, like you just said, didn't put the tribes just back 100 or even 200 years. I mean, it's really
Mhm.
wonderful to find out about certain aspects, like wild rice, right? It was grown um, in the Great Lakes region. It was a very main source of food, but are they still using it as their main source of food today? I mean, there's one thing to understand the beginnings and the earliest essence of a culture. Then there's another thing to see where the culture is in this moment in time. And it's actually, I found that a
Mhm.
lot harder to find.
It is. I think it's difficult to find, or it can be difficult to find in a short amount of time. Here in Maine, though, it was in the early 90s where the mascot issue really hit a peak. And a lot of us, a lot of indigenous people here were visiting schools, talking with schools, with students and teachers about the consequences of mascots. Uh, I'm going off in the left field here, but there was the state required that a curriculum was developed that focused specifically on Wabanaki people, and that curriculum was mandated to be in every school, which is really great. So in some places, you know, there's more information that's readily available, and in other places, you have to dig. And I think part of the reason why is because people are guarded nowadays. You know, with this whole topic of cultural appropriation is obviously not new, and it's not isolated. The idea of hundreds of years of people from away, and I mean away, not just from another state, but of course from across the ocean. There's not an easy way to talk about genocide, but that's, I think that how people are guarded is a direct consequence of the effort to exterminate indigenous people. And so I think, you know, sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper, a little bit harder in order to access what's there. And one other consequence of, I think, of genocide and is that people have been removed from aspects of culture, and depending on who it is that you talk to, and I would say that appearances can be deceiving. You know, there are folks that you might come in contact with who, for all intents and purposes, look like they're the culture bearers, the knowledge keepers of whatever peoples they come from. But they may have been in a boarding school. They may have been completely removed from, isolated from any aspects of their culture, and consequently, well, not they might not know anything about it, and so one way to deal with that feeling of what's the word I'm looking for here? Feeling of what? Feeling inadequate? I guess the word's irrelevant. Is to be secretive about, you know, whatever knowledge they have or don't have. So sometimes digging it can be difficult.
Well, I find it actually embarrassing when I say, well, what do you want to be called? Because I've been talking about you for almost a year now. And it's such an untimely request that I'm embarrassed to bring it up now.
Well, don't be embarrassed. I would say if you didn't ask the question, then you could be embarrassed. Asking the question takes maybe a little bit more courage or what have you, but it's a really important question to ask. So you should pat yourself on the back, or Tom, pat her on the back when we're off camera. It's a good question to ask.
I find the older I get, the more ignorant I feel. And we were talking about this the other day, about how I feel empathy and compassion for people, but sometimes I honestly feel that that isn't enough, because I haven't walked a mile in other people's shoes. I can't really understand. And that deep lying understanding is a barrier of sorts that, you know, I grew up white. I grew up white in an area that was, actually, I grew up white Protestant in an area that was mostly either Italian, Catholic, WASP Protestant, or Jewish. So I didn't fit in anywhere. And it was a very odd feeling. And I grew up right next to a town that was mostly Black. When we had race riots, there was straight across my street was blocked off. So there's things in my experience from that I can't give my children, And I'm thankful actually that some of my experiences I can't give them, because
Mm.
I am aware of having prejudices that I wish I didn't have. And I worked really hard on not passing them on. And I look at it like, wow, you don't have that. Great. I did at least one thing right. But it's really hard because I find myself, I've come to the point where I've come, and I know there's more things I need to learn and to peel off layers of prejudice and ignorance. And it's not that it's disheartening, it's that I know I'm never going to be able to do it all. I'm never really going to be able to understand as many people as I want to.
I applaud you. I think it's so vitally important to have that awareness of self, and to say, to be able to say I'm ignorant is really powerful. It's a wonderful example for the rest of us who haven't reached that level of strength to be able to say it. Once we identify, I think that that we don't have the knowledge that we would like to have, as I mentioned much earlier, it opens the door for that knowledge to come in. I think if when we find ourselves at a place of saying, I'm not ignorant, I know everything about everything, then of course we're closed to receiving any other knowledge. I applaud that, what you just said, and I'm hoping this will be a part of the video that's being made. I hope it's a wonderful example for all of us.
Well, for better, for worse, my words are always here. Atula, is there anything that you'd like to say before we sign off on this?
No, I think it's just wonderful to hear these amazing thoughts from all of you. It's just that it would do so much good if there is respect and sensitivity to others' cultures and situations, and be willing to enter into their world and genuinely try to learn and understand their culture, their situation. It has to go deeper than just dancing with them during a festival or other occasions. And then there's the need also to tread gently on others' culture to avoid hurting the sentiment that is deeply rooted in the sacredness of that culture. So yes, respecting and appreciating the culture and learning from one another is a necessary step to bring people together.
Thank you very much, both of you, for
Yes, thank you both.
being here and discussing this very, very difficult issue. I really thank you. For those of you who've been watching, if you'd like to find out more information about Dracut Arts, please go to dracutarts.com.